Savannah was hit at least three times by what we would consider today pretty major hurricanes in the last 20 years of the 19th century. Of course, the 1881 hurricane was one of them, 1893, and then again in 1898. A major hurricane is considered now to be Category 3 or above. The 1881 hurricane was a Category 2 storm, but nevertheless, very destructive, came in at night. It was a Saturday night, late August 1881. Of course, Savannah not developed in the same way that it is now, but it came in at high tide, and it came in the dark. It was about 9:30. So you can imagine it brought a great deal of terror just by coming in at night, not being able to see exactly what's going on. The population up and down the coastal islands of Georgia, of course, at that time, primarily African American. Many of them were living in what we would consider today, I think, housing that was less than substantial in terms of being able to withstand this kind of weather. So the death rate was tremendous in and around Savannah. It came in with a very high storm surge that, from what I understand and reading the reports, and the reports were not available immediately. The first report I've been able to find was in an Augusta newspaper 2 days later on Monday, the 29th, that recorded that there was a huge storm surge that inundated many of the buildings, of course, on River Street and Bay Street. A lot of structures, a lot of ships that were in the bay or in the harbor were destroyed. Roofs were torn off buildings, whether it be those that were owned by the Central of Georgia Railroad, or there were rice warehouses that were destroyed. And of course, anything inside. So there's a lot of economic damage, obviously. There's a lot of structural damage, but more than anything, tremendous loss of life. This storm resulted in, as far as we can tell, about 335, probably a lot more deaths in and around Savannah. The best guess is that it really made landfall somewhere around Ossabaw Islands, between St. Simons and Savannah. Again, a Category 2 storm. So the winds in Savannah were recorded at about 80 miles an hour until the wind gauging equipment was torn to pieces. So might have been higher, very low pressure in terms of millibars. So a very powerful storm that would wreak all kinds of havoc today, and it did then. Remember, too, that residents would have had very little warning. Obviously, there's no such thing as the internet. The telephone has just been invented maybe 5 years earlier, not widely in use at that time, particularly in coastal Georgia. And so other than the fact that people probably noticed shifting winds and heavy rain, there's very little chance at evacuation. So that's one reason the death count was so high. Coming in at high tide, for instance, all of the Isle of Hope was underwater. Most of downtown was underwater for several hours before this thing moved on. So a lot of buildings collapsed. A lot of the death was due to either drownings, people were washed out to sea, homes were washed out to sea, and not quick relief, as you can imagine, either. We know in the 1890, I think it was the 1893 storm, which happened on the very same day, August 27th, not a lucky day for people in the Low Country in the late 19th century. It happened on August 27th, but the Red Cross didn't arrive until the 1st of October to administer any relief. There was no national, there was no FEMA or anything like that at that time. So a lot of death and a lot of suffering, and it went on for a while. So this still ranks. There were like 700 people killed before this storm dissipated somewhere over northwest Mississippi later in that week. And it still ranks, as best we can tell, as probably the 10th deadliest hurricane to ever hit the United States.